Good evening and welcome to the third discussion in the new GoMA Talks series here at the Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane. I'm Jan Ryan from By Design on ABC Radio National, and Radio National is the co-presenter of this program of talks where the big issues of the 21st century are being explored. GoMA Talks is held in conjunction with the current exhibition here at the Gallery, 21st Century Art in the First Decade. Now, I'm your host tonight with our special guests. Together, we will be discussing the idea of the art museum in the 21st century. What does the art museum look like and stand for in the 21st century? Now, GoMA Talks is live. There's a live webcast via 21cblog.com. And if you're online, tweet us with your questions, comments and feedback using the hashtag GoMA Talks. So that's GOMA Talks, T-A-L-K-S, GoMA Talks. And we'll do our best to include what we can in the discussion. And we'll also be taking questions from the audience. So there's a lot to do and a lot to get through. So welcome our panel. Tony. And I'd like to introduce you to them. Tony Elwood, to my far right here, and you can see the titles at the front, is Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, which includes the Gallery of Modern Art, which is where we are tonight, which opened in December 2006. Now, prior to taking up this position in 2007, Tony was Deputy Director, International Art at the National Gallery of Victoria. And prior to that, he held positions as the Director of Bendigo Art Gallery and the Aboriginal Art Coordinator at Warringari Arts, Aboriginal Arts at Kununurra in the Kimberley. So Tony was on the selection committee for the 2003 and 2007 Venice Biennales. Now, Callum Morton, who's here on my left, is a Melbourne-based artist, and he's known for his large-scale, architecturally inspired installations. Now, Callum represented Australia at the 2007 Venice Biennale, and last year in 2010, Callum presented his first large-scale installation for children, Ghost World, at the Queensland Art Gallery's Children Arts Centre here. Now, also Juliana Engberg, to the far left, is an adjunct Professor in Architecture and Art at RMIT University in Melbourne. And there she is also the Director of the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, ACCA, and you may know that gallery, of course. She is a curator, writer, publisher and designer who has been described by Art Forum magazine as Australia's most maverick and ambitious curator of contemporary art. Welcome, Juliana Engberg. And also, all the way from Hobart is Brian Ritchie, who's the curator of Mona FOMA, and that's the Museum of Old and New Arts Festival of Music and Art, which is based in Hobart, Tasmania. Well, that's its home anyhow. Brian's love for music stems from his role as the bass guitarist for the alternative rock group The Violent Femmes. His role in developing the annual Mona FOMA Festival includes promoting and showcasing the work of artists in a broad range of art forms: sound, noise, dance, theatre, visual art, performance and new media. Please welcome Brian Ritchie and the panel. So tonight we will discuss a range of approaches to the art museum, from innovations in architecture and contemporary art to engaging with and sustaining audiences and the strategic decisions facing the future of the museum, with a capital T and M. So to start, here we are in the 21st century. We're at the Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane. It's very easy for us to see a contemporary gallery, to experience a contemporary art museum, but it hasn't always been like this. There's been a lot of hurdles to get over from then to now. So Tony Elwood, how is the Contemporary Art Museum different from museums past?
I think the fundamental shift from my experience, which is about 20 years now, would be the audience. That we're very much about being audience-driven, aware of our audience, respectful of a democratic audience. We're aware of racial diversity, socio-economic difference. There was a time when I started my training in the early 90s where people openly talked about a more elite approach to audience, that we would consciously target certain enclaves that we felt were the right fit. And they tended to be that more elitist tag. So, within 20 years, we're now obsessive about talking about how do we ensure we've tapped into as many different types of audiences we're aware of in our community and that have access to this sort of facility within the region.
Well, we're going to pick up on that really important issue of audience and what that means and break down those various categories. Juliana, you run an art gallery. So what to you is a contemporary art museum, and what have we had to get rid of to get here?
Well, I don't work in a museum, and I think it's important to make that distinction. I work in a contemporary art space, and it understands its audience to be quite informed, to have a vested interest in certain ways because it has a practitioner element to it. But of course, even we, along with Tony and the museum crowd, need to now respond to the extra interest that seems to be accruing to culture. And I suppose that it's very clear that education has a strong role to play in that. And I think we're seeing the museum and indeed the art gallery like mine of certain scale becoming a kind of open campus for the public where they can engage in various levels and in various different sorts of ways with the way in which culture is being, currently created. And I think that's one of the really interesting problems also, I think, for the museum title there, because Gertrude Stein once said you can be modern or contemporary, but you can't be both. The museum tends to suggest a slightly backward-looking thing, a thing that assembles an idea for you, is somewhat more encyclopedic in its behaviour, whereas a contemporary art space is of the now. And what's happening here in GoMA, I think, is quite groundbreaking. It's quite world-leading, in a sense, in as much as it is quite convincingly blending those two things together. The place is heaving. I mean, that is one of the greatest differences that we see between, say, 25 years ago and now. The places are just chock-a-block. And that is promoting a sort of different way of dealing with art and space, I think.
Well, there's a big force there, and it's the audience.
It's a huge...
Like never before.
It's a huge force. And look, it needs to also be reckoned with in terms of how do we deal with art in this new big audience. Today, for instance, up in the video space here at GoMA, a lot of kids were in the space, and they were very much enjoying it, but really for themselves, they were using the backdrop of art to actually perform against. And so if you actually really were interested in Isaac Julien's work, you couldn't see it, because they were in fact actually invading that space to do something quite different with it. Now, a lot of people would say that's good because they're interacting and they're engaging, but I think there is something that we need to do to make certain that the art experience is still intact and available for people who wish to engage with it, while we're not, disengaging with the people who are bringing a lot of energy to our enterprise.
Well, there's a whole issue there of what is even art, and we can't answer that tonight, but we're trying to look at these ideas. Let's frame it slightly differently. Brian Ritchie, what do you think the Contemporary Gallery is, and the 21st Century Art Museum, if I can continue to use that word, main responsibilities?
Well, Mona is a private museum, so we don't really think that we have any responsibilities.
Interesting. Refreshing.
And but that's an anomaly, because obviously if it's privately funded, then we don't have, there's no pressure to feel like we're serving the public in the way that Tony was mentioning, although we do that anyway.
So
it's just that we don't feel like we're obliged to cater to different elements of the public. However, we are getting those kind of demographics anyway, just by doing. David Walsh is the protagonist behind our museum. It reflects very much his idiosyncrasies and eccentric tastes in art and presentation, and his attitude, which is kind of more like a punk rock type attitude than an art curator or historian or academic type of an attitude. So the museum, as we see it, it's experiential rather than being educational in a kind of linear fashion like museums of the past, where you go from one chronological space to another, one stylistic space to another, and it's systematically ordered. Our museum is very disordered, and it's engages people in that way because it's coming up against their expectations.
I don't really think it is disordered at all. I'm sorry to break in straight.
No, go for it, Joanna. So I want to bring Callum in here, the artist.
But yes, I know. But in fact, I think that it's quite orderly because David's aesthetic is driving a lot of the decisions and a lot of the connections that are being made between the various things. It's a delight, actually, that museum, because aesthetically it is very brought together. There's a wonderful moment, for instance, where David has put a stool that has very tightly bound rope around it in front of the Daniel Cook's digital work, which is a kind of thing where it crunches time and persons, and the seat and the thing go together aesthetically beautifully. And that's a wonderful kind of, not disorderly, but orderly reckoning of two unreconcilable things, a seat and a video thing, but it's a fantastic moment.
It's using juxtaposition as a tool.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I meant by saying it was disordered, I meant it's not linear in the sense that all of our antiquities, because we're the Museum of Old and New Art, so we have a lot of antiquities, we have a lot of contemporary art, not much from in between. The antiquities are not like all grouped in one part of the museum, or we don't have it grouped by place of origin. It's grouped more according, as you're saying, by the ideas and how they work together, rather than just saying this is this, put it together.
Certainly.
This is this.
But just before I bring you in, we've got a tweet here that might fit in with this. Who cares what a 21st century gallery looks like? What does it experience like? So that's an interesting point, picks up on what you were saying. Callum, you're the artist here.
Well, I'm just going to respond to what Brian was saying, that the museum, or Mona, is it's a good model for this question of how do you experience old work, or how do you experience history alongside contemporary work. So you're describing the traditional museum as dividing things chronologically and traditional taxonomies. Well, it does. I mean, this has been done before, of course, but it does it in a new way for us that keeps those works alive. So that's one of the big questions, I guess, for contemporary museums. How do you preserve history?
Well, we'll get to that question too. We just could be here for a week at least on one question. Now, let's pick up on the audience. We'll work through some of these things. Tony Elwood, the audience, your best friend. Bringing people to contemporary art. This is a large part of your work, I'm assuming. Are there audiences who can't be convinced? Let's just go to that side for the moment and see whether you think that, and if so, why, and if not, why not?
I don't think there are, but I have had people who've tried to fight the experience and challenge my assumption. I think there are so many platforms available to us today. If we're really committed, as I know we are as an institution, to trying to find various ways in which we can unlock the values of that work or the artist's mind or whatever it might be, the intent of the curatorial premise and so on, I think we can get there. I've worked up against some pretty tough audiences in my own career history, and often it's come down to that personal interpretation, access to people, opportunities and a comfortable place to be able to ask questions that they may feel embarrassed to ask in a more public forum, or to sort of inquire, or even to invest the time to inquire with. So, things like your mob tags and your blog sites and your catalogue and your voluntary guided tours, your extended labels, your didactic panels. There are so many things. You look at this exhibition, I think we've almost run out of things that you can do to help interpret contemporary art, and that's because of that absolute belief that everyone should be experiencing it and understanding it. They don't necessarily need to like it, but we have to find every platform possibly known to help convert those people.
An interesting tweet here. How much is a 21st century art museum about art these days, or is it more about the building architecture to attract visitors? Now, that's...
Look, can I just comment on that? Because one of the things, if I don't say it, we are a soft target because we are innovative and we're in Brisbane. I have to say that. And I said recently in an interview, we work twice as hard to get half the recognition because we are in Brisbane. And I know it's not a thing that you should openly probably say, but I am experiencing it daily, so I'm putting it out there. If I don't mention collection building, scholarship, the artist, then it's that classic evidence that, yes, you're dumbing down the institution. You've got too many things that are too easy to like when you first walk into the gallery. It's about a fun park. It's about this whole new take on art. It's just disappointing that by trying to really show that we're demonstrating just how much we want to reach out to whole ranges of audiences, that we then become a target. Contemporary art is always going to be the most critiqued and the most misunderstood of all the different art histories.
It's, I suppose, by its nature, at its best is disruptive. But let's just take something very practical here, because it picks up on that thing, it picks up on a point you just said. There's suddenly, out of the blue, apparently, seemingly, certainly in time been, or in our time anyhow, the very big piece of art. There's some here in the foyer. Callum does very big pieces of art. Venice Biennale artists often do. Now, how important is that?
Scale?
Yeah.
Well, it's really about artist's intent. You know,
Is
we
it?
also have some very little art in this current exhibition. It is about the intimate gaze around the work. Sure, contemporary art museums really need to accommodate.
Big splash, people see it.
Well, ACCA does it beautifully. You know, big scale, big ideas, big works. That's a part of it.
And I would slightly disagree with you. I think that that it's artist-led. I think it's opportunity-led. And one of the things that's happened is that architecture has begun to shape opportunity for artists. I mean, 25 years ago we were looking at more salon-type spaces. We were looking at cubic spaces that were probably 10 by 10, 12 by 12 metres. That seemed like a generous scale. We're now experiencing quite different scaled places. This has actually been retail-led. Back when they were starting to redesign the museum of the 21st century in the latter part of the 20th century, people started to put in big atrium spaces and gathering points so that they had places that they could then on-sell for events and make some income with. And then they had a big shop area. They had to have a cafe. This provided a circumstance of creating void spaces that then had to be filled. And so in many ways, architecture led by the necessity of income, which is generating retail elements, has provided spaces that artists may now encounter. And so we have something like the Tate turbine effect, where we have a very, very cavernous kind of space that somehow needs to be dealt with. And in the main, I think that space, for instance, has been dealt with very creatively by artists, very thoughtfully by artists, not always 100% successful, but it really has, provided what I might call the opportunity of the postmodern sublime, a kind of awesome scale that people encounter and go, wow, the wow factor, therefore.
That's what I mean.
Which is a production of the spectacle, and I sometimes think, and perhaps it doesn't matter, a lot of the audience wouldn't be fully acquainted with some of the political and theoretical social baggage that comes with the concept of the spectacle, but it's certainly, I think, very much inherent in the activity of artists still, who are using, in a sly kind of way, these opportunities for big-scaled works to actually provoke a different kind of response.
Would you have done, for example, Ghost World here at GoMA 10 years ago?
Well, that's a hypothetical question.
Can you answer it?
Well, I can answer it by saying that I would not have been offered that 10 years ago, because I guess there wasn't, well, there wasn't the space to do it. Clearly GoMA has constructed a space, and indeed, ACCA, Juliana commissioned me to do a work in 2004 called Babylonia, which ended up at Mona. But I think it's all mixed up. I mean, on the one hand, artists do respond to the museum. Clearly, there are bigger spaces. The Turbine Hall is a good example where, someone comes to you and says, can you do a work for that hall? You have to think about that context specifically. But I was making work in the early 90s, that was too large for any gallery, to occupy. And I wasn't.
And you were using scale.
And I was using scale, and I wasn't interested in the museum. We were showing at artist-run spaces, and I was a reluctant participant in the commercial sphere, indeed. So there was a drive, I think, in my generation to make work like this that. I guess it was kind of, yes, it was an interest in the theatre of the spectacle, but I think my generation was schooled in postmodernity, and I guess the core, whatever you think of postmodernity, its grand narrative was the language of inclusion, And I think that was when the evolution of art and music, connections to art and music, art and science, art and design, all those things evolved. And certainly in the academies, it was the rise of cultural studies.
And it's when we started to see art becoming intra-environmental in a kind of way. We started to see the real extensive activity of installation. You know, installation all of a sudden started to make use of different set of areas within the gallery sphere, and actually wanted people to occupy a space. It didn't just hang on the walls, and it wasn't very discreet. It actually required a great deal more activity on the part of the audience. You know, they had to negotiate their way around. They actually had to use art as some kind of measure against themselves.
Yes. But also it was the language of inclusion. So at the same time, people studying curatorial studies or critical theory, they're the curators and indeed the directors of today.
Yeah.
And they're responding to this larger audience, or this demand for culture to be appreciated in a larger way than it was in the past.
Brian, at Mona, and you're doing music, well, you're doing a whole lot of things. Here we're talking about physical pieces of art, but is there a kind of big acoustic, or, I mean, is there anything from your world that would work differently in this kind of architecture that perhaps would give some insight into why these pieces are different?
Well, I'd like to actually get back to a little bit of what Juliana was talking about earlier, about the use of these large spaces were being commercially driven, because I was actually talking to my golfing friend, Jim Jones, who was one of the architects who designed this museum, GoMA. And he mentioned that some of these large spaces are to be used as kind of like a public, like town square or piazza type.
Exactly, gathering
environment. He didn't really mention commercially driven. And then, of course, there's the demand for these large artworks, which is fascinating considering how, as the world space keeps getting to be more and more valuable. So the scope of these artworks becomes even more outsized. Whereas in the past, when space was cheap, Mona Lisa was like this. So is this going to continue that way?
I can't imagine it will eventually. It will have to sort of move back a little bit, I suppose. And I suppose that leads neatly to, you know, a conversation about how do we cohabit some of these things. We're going to need to actually have spaces that can still accommodate a much more thoughtful, contemplative, and perhaps even more studious kind of encounter with art, while we also continue to actually provide these opportunities of great excitement and involvement, etc. But I'm a little concerned. I'm getting a little bit concerned that we're at a point where we mustn't lose focus on art and where it's come from and why it's come that way, so that, you know, generations who are being captivated by these new adventurous ways of dealing with, you know, big spaces and spectacle works, etc., have somewhere else to go to actually link back, because, you know, that is also our job. So I'm hoping that when we see the next sort of stage of design, that we begin to see opportunities for greater depth of curatorial practice and greater depth of exhibition displays, so that we've got you know, parallel things happening, not just a monolithic, you know, big thing or you know, a small set of tiny things, but perhaps an interlocking opportunity.
Can I just say that just one thing? I think in this whole discussion, I think we've forgotten the 1970s. I think actually it's been much more artist-driven than we're actually giving it credit for. The whole evolution of performance art and installation art really started 30, 35 years ago. It took our governments and our, you know, public infrastructure and investments that long to respond to that need. I do think it's I give far more credit to the artists' needs than I think we are giving in this particular discussion. And I also think scale doesn't necessarily attribute to being dumbed down or of less significance. Every work, for example, of large scale in here is driven by the artists, not driven by us.
No, I didn't say they weren't significant or important. And I mean, certainly there is a very strong element of that aesthetic and that interest coming through from the late 60s and 70s, where, in fact, we saw the precious object break down and we saw a whole range of things happen to engage the audience. I absolutely agree with that. And I'm not suggesting that scale or monumentality necessarily means stupid, but I think that there is a point at which we're going to have to actually taper that back a little bit so that we make certain that we bring the other things up at the same time.
I just don't see why the two are mutually exclusive.
No, they're not. No.
I suppose in the 60s and 70s, performance art, installation art, etc., or conceptual art in particular, were anti-institutional. They were engaged in, you know, the great critique.
And they were
of the
less
museum.
production-based.
Yes, and they weren't really included in the museum. So it's different now. It's those things have kind of, I don't know if they've softened, but the fact that it's kind of included into the museum now has changed our artist's perspective on what value that has. Like, are you playing out the kind of theatre of museum critique rather than actually critiquing the museum? But my point about it all being mixed up was that all those forces are now kind of housed, you know, in the museum, and the curators, the directors, everyone are on a similar page. So it's artist-driven, but I mean, could curators become artists? I mean, that's kind of a bigger question. I mean, is the museum as a site of event also, you know, a site of production?
Well, it is, of course. I mean, we see it that way.
Well, let me just...
But can a museum be that? I don't know.
Let me just remind everybody where we are and why we're here. And just before I do that, there's a tweet here which says, what is the role of the traditional museum now, or are these out of date? Now, if you're just joining us, welcome to GoMA Talks. I'm Jan Ryan from By Design on ABC Radio National. And tonight we're exploring the 21st Century Art Museum with Tony Elwood, who's the director of the Queensland Art Gallery and the Gallery of Modern Art, GoMA, artist Callum Morton, Brian Ritchie, curator of the Museum of Old and New Art Music Festival in Tasmania, and Juliana Engberg, who's the artistic director of the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, known as ACCA. Now, we're going to take questions from the audience, so there are people roaming around with microphones. Put your hand up and we can take a question if you want to. So we'll just get you going, get you ready for that. And go to you, Juliana, and pick up on some of these points that are being, interesting points that are being thrown into the air here. And I'll ask everybody this, because it's, to me, a really interesting question. What constitutes a meaningful experience in an art museum? Again, sorry about the word museum.
They're multiple, and this is, I think, everything.
What is for you?
For me, it's multiple as well. You know, it could be that... you know, recently I went to see the Bauhaus archive in Berlin. It's a very tiny little space. That was a very meaningful visit, though. I've reacquainted myself with a couple of things that are just splendid to remind yourself of in terms of the nascent issues of modernism, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed it on an intellectual level. I enjoyed it on an aesthetic level, and I actually enjoyed the smallness of it to some extent. But when I come to the Hamburger Bahnhof, for instance, where I saw recently Carsten Holler's spectacle of reindeers and psychedelia and mice and people sleeping and all of that sort of thing, I was equally excited. I was intellectually stimulated. I was certainly sensorily stimulated. I was perplexed as well, and so that is a very different kind of encounter. If art is good, and you know, if it has the kind of ingredients that make it good, you will always come to it and respond to it in a whole host of different ways. And that, of course, is what is happening here, for certain. There is just as much excitement in a bunch of kids looking at that chandelier of plastic bags that are colourful and going, wow, as it is for me coming and going, I know that comes from actually, you know, a sort of system of colour which, you know, links to Bauhaus, which links to a whole bunch of other sorts of things too.
Well, I've got a question, but Callum, if we can just get a sense of what the experience means for you, and then we'll take the question from the audience.
It's multiple. I agree with Juliana completely. I saw a room of Velázquez paintings in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna recently, and I'd never seen one of his pictures, and that was a fantastic experience, you know, and I can have that experience alongside, you know, the spectacle of, you know, the Tate Modern, you know, and enjoy both equally, and then equally not go to the museum and go to other things, you know, outside in the world that are just as good, and so it's a plurality of experiences, and you know, there's nothing directed about it.
But it all adds up to the whole. What about you, Brian? Is there anything that's front of mind as such?
I think we all agree. It's good to have different experiences. traveling all over the world and going to all these different museums, and some of them are dedicated only to the work of one artist, and that can be incredibly rich, like the Van Gogh Museum. There's no better way to spend a few hours than to go there, even though it's only one artist. Or to go to the, as Callum mentioned, the Kunsthistorische Museum is one of the best in the world, and there's no way that you'd be familiar with everything that's in there, but to walk through the space is mind-boggling.
Tony?
Well, for me, it's just an emotional reaction, emotional shift, and I'm going to use a complete contrast as an example. But when I've been out judging regional exhibitions in Queensland, and I've met the practitioner and watched their faces, they articulate why that work was so important to them, and the process of making that can emotionally shift me as much as it can looking at Karsten, for example. So it's the practitioner's reaction to the work and your imagining of that reaction as they produce the work, or just the message in the work. But it's about an emotional
I just want to add the
engagement.
hashtag here.
There was such a nice moment in the gallery today. Sorry, Jane, but I just do want to say, because there's a lovely exhibition in your display at the moment, Tony, which has finches in it, and they balance beautifully on little coat hangers and stuff. There was a woman in there, and she was just in rapture. It's a very quiet space as compared to a lot of the hectic other stuff that's going on in the other parts of the museum. And it was a sort of respite for her, I think, but also a kind of sanctuary. And the bird life and the song of the bird was so beautiful. It was just so charming. And so that's the kind of mixture of experiences that you can have. One which is really frantic, the other one which is still and calm.
Well, I like the idea of rapture.
It was beautiful.
Now, I just want to remind you that the hashtag is GoMA Talks, GOMA Talks, plural, GoMA Talks. So you can tweet away. I've got a question from the audience. Can you just say who you are and who you would like to address the question to?
I'm going to declare my interest first. I'm the Deputy Director here and I look after children's programming. So Juliana's got me all fired up. So
okay, go for it. Say who you are. Just say your name.
Andrew Clark.
Andrew Clark.
Juliana, I'm interested in your comment about Isaac Julian, and I suppose my philosophy is the museum is for everybody. You know, I take that view that whether you're a child, whether you're an adult, whoever you are, you should be welcome in here. And you know, your comment about Isaac Julian, about the children interfering with the experience, if you could wait 5 minutes, they could leave and you could have your experience. Can't we both have the experience? Is it, you know, is that such a bad thing to have those people in here engaging? Is it either or? Can't we both have it?
I'd like to think that that's true, and of course I am a great devotee of the idea of children and art. We spend a huge amount of our own energy doing it, and I do believe it. I'm a true believer in get them young and you keep them and so forth. But I also do think that the artist has a reason to expect that their work will be seen in a particularly respectful sort of way. And that to me is not the way that work is intended to be seen. And so, yes, of course, this is one of the chicken and egg things. Do we then, still the kids and say that's not the appropriate place for that in order to maintain the integrity of the artwork and risk them thinking, well, then, art galleries are boring. I think they were probably bored by the work anyway because they found it much more entertaining to use it as shadow play. I think there is a need for us to balance these things. And, if I were an artist, I would like to hope that my work is seen by, people the way I expected it to be viewed. And I think that's just a respectful thing that we must keep in mind because we're custodians and carers of someone's, purpose and creativity. And, we have a kind of contract with the artist, really, and I think that is important.
Can I jump in?
One quick thing, just, Isaac Julian, when he saw that work and saw children interacting with it, was inspired to ask us, could we commission a work for children by him after seeing that reaction? So, I just think these things are very complex arguments and that audience is just a really critical one to our future.
Okay, but I'm an audience too, and I actually have a reason to expect to be able to see that work. I'm not trying to be against children in museums. I work all my life to actually bring them to these spaces, but I do think that we need to manage that quite carefully.
Can I just comment on that? Because we actually do have what are also known as invigilators, which actually will discreetly walk through the galleries and will actually, when they see something that they may feel is tipping over, the reading of an artwork, we'll actually ask them to sit back or to leave the
It
space.
it did last for 10 minutes.
And that would have happened. I have also been in contemporary art spaces where I've been followed by the security to the point where I've had to leave.
Yeah, sure.
Because, and that's happened to be at ACCA, I have to be really honest.
Well, and I'm sorry.
It has.
Okay.
It has.
So dodgy.
And I had
That's
someone who
the
backed
thing.
me up on this.
Can I just...
And I'm sorry. and I'm
I
not,
remember you telling me that.
yeah, I did tell you that because it actually, in fact, the person I was with was actually very upset
Yeah, no,
because
I
it felt
remember
like we were being socially profiled.
Yeah.
So there is
Right.
that. There
Well-
is.
Can I just jump in?
that extreme.
Can I jump in?
And I did speak to that person, actually.
Just want to...
True story.
Sternly.
They've lost their job. I just want to jump in and say
Callum
that
Morton.
for the artist to think about audience is a very difficult thing to do. I know I don't... I mean, of course, with the Children's Art Centre show specifically, there was... I knew what the audience was, but generally, I don't sit around thinking how someone should encounter this work and who is the best person to encounter it. It's just not something I direct, and perhaps it's because... of the type of work I make, and but I think it's not really, unfortunately, it's not really the business of artists to sit around contemplating what their audience will be. When I first started, we showed at an artist-run space called Store 5 in Prahran in Melbourne, very local, and our motto was an audience of one is enough.
And sometimes you got that. That was good.
Sometimes we didn't get the one.
Okay, well, look, that raises some interesting questions here. Tony, I'd like to ask you. I mean, in the past, I don't know quite what we're saying when we say in the past, but there's been a kind of, with galleries and museums, or what we used to call museums, and we still call galleries, that there's been a sort of resistance to entertainment and leisure as an experience. It's kind of like you've got to be informed. Now, do you think that in this process, you did mention before that the gallery hasn't been dumbed down, but you were referring to the architectural space as a driver on that, and I'm wondering if the content, if you can sort of put in context the content in a different way. Do you feel it's shifted? I mean, dumbed down is a word that's often used when something shifts away from the way we used to understand it. How has the content shifted in perception, do you think?
The content, in my view, is just becoming more accessible, and our audience is becoming more informed before they enter the institution. And that's all to do with social media and the different platforms we make available as an industry. I
mean, you're saying accessible, and that's another word that people...
Accessible and democratic.
Yeah.
Which I still think our industry has not honestly grappled with, both our historic and contemporary. I think it's still an issue, and I think management of that as a phenomena as it unfolds is still a challenge, as is evidenced by Juliana's observations. I mean, we talk about cultural tourism. I mean, I remember when I started here 4 years ago, we didn't, I don't believe, really talk about that until we collectively got together as a group with our government, trustees and everybody else and said, let's actually do something more with it, let's package it up and let's sell it in this way. And let's not cringe when we do it, because what it means is more art, more investment, more exposure, more global practice being seen, more investment in our local artists. I mean, it can only create a bigger industry. We went from 1 million visitors when we opened to 1.8 million last year. Yeah. And massive growth on our social media. We were talking about it before. All institutions in Australia have had something like a 600 or 700% pickup in social media in 1 year. So the audience is hungry. So why not see it as a part of a tourism leisure industry? It is.
Well, here's a tweet. Isn't the loss of elitism in art galleries a strike against the purest notions of capitalism? Now, that sounds like it comes from 1970. However, I mean, in a way what we're talking about as well is money. I'm wondering whether you have any sense of what accessibility and the words dumb down mean. Do they mean anything to you?
Well,
Does it matter that these words are thrown around?
I think this is a media word, and I don't believe it. I think that art is not dumbed down. I think it has become very complicated indeed. It is highly sophisticated. And our task in the museum and art gallery world is to make multiple entry points for the work. And so that people can come into it at a various stage of platforms and encounter it at a purely entertainment level, that's fine. At a connoisseur level, that's fine as well. Perhaps somewhere in between and so forth. But I don't believe in this concept of the dumb down. I think this is something that media say to denigrate
That's
art.
the media's fault.
I think it's a lazy commentary on the part of some media commentators, yeah. And I think it's a sort of derogatory thing to say.
I suppose it's a shorthand for saying it's different.
But it's just not true.
Yeah,
I mean, we're just actually a far, far more sophisticated machine than we ever have been. And the proof is in the pudding. The fact that there are so many people coming to art means that something really good is happening.
Well, something's happening in Hobart at FONA, and, it's certainly not been called dumbed down. It's been called out there, right on the edge, and everybody's going. What's your experience of it, Brian?
Who are the gatekeepers? In the past, it's been academics and people with a fairly dry sense of, but I disagree with this theory that some art is entertainment and some is very serious. I think it's all entertainment.
It's all entertainment.
If somebody really likes a very intellectual kind of art that might be completely conceptual, process art, something where the end result is not even the important point. That's still entertainment for a person who's into that kind of entertainment.
Exactly.
Wrestling is entertainment for someone who's into wrestling. Everything that's in between is entertainment for all those people. So I think art is entertainment regardless of what it is, and it has to be. And I think
it always has been.
the gatekeepers are just different people now. So you have different people choosing what's going to be shown, and the fact that there are more people coming to it, I think, shows that maybe better decisions are being made. You no longer have rooms of just a bunch of old ladies and their kids, that were all painted, or just the same picture of the mother and child, over and over again. Curators wouldn't do that now. They're making more diverse selections.
Yeah.
So. It is more entertaining.
But
maybe
one day
it's
that
more
might be
diverse.
refreshing again.
It
Yeah.
may
Well, everything old is new, as we know.
Well, one of the great successes of recent times has been Francis Elise's project, which showed the multiple portraits of Fabia, was it? That was outstanding. People went to it in droves, and just because they were seeing this one thing repeated time and time and time again. So yeah, it's already happening, Callum.
Hashtag GoMA Talks if you want to tweet. GoMA, G-O-M-A, Talks, T-A-L-K-S. GoMA Talks, hashtag is GoMA Talks. Now, just to pick up on this idea of education and accessibility and so on, Juliana, art used to be seen as, and culture, again, I don't know, these are dense words, but anyhow, just to get going. It was a way, partly caught up in the elitism of education and the teaching of us, which I think we're understanding tonight that, in a way we're not taught anymore, we experience it and we come with knowledge to that door. But in the old days, it used to improve us, we were seen to be civilised and educated through this process. Is this still the case?
Well, we understand the concept of improvement quite differently now, I think.
How do we understand
Well, we have an arsenal of information that's coming to us through science that tells us about the brain and how it is made healthy by certain things, and art is certainly very much a part of that. I mean, for instance, and here at GoMA they certainly do it, at ACCA we do it too, where we've started to look at haptic learning.
What's that?
Haptic learning is learning by making and doing and touching and activating those sensory things, so that even quite complicated things can be understood by people if they've actually gone about having a go at making it themselves. And so I think we're all thinking quite differently. It's not just about a studious connoisseurship based, learn the dates and things. It's actually about experiencing it, but on a whole range of different sorts of levels.
So you don't need to show off your knowledge anymore.
No, but I think you learn and gain knowledge through making and doing and just having a practical sense of what that does. But it also activates a whole lot of cognitive stuff that is very good for us. And I mean, this is great news for art. This has been fantastic news for the cultural industries in general, dance as well, music, that we now have some really, good statistics and crunchy numbers that we can put in front of people and say, what we've been telling you intuitively for many, many years is in fact actually being proven to be so. And this gives us, some way of talking with governments and funders and people who actually really are excited about these, innovations.
if anybody wants to ask a question in the audience, put your hand up and we will run to you with a microphone and I'll look out for you. So think up a question, put your hand up, and then we'll go to you when we can. Another interesting element which we haven't really discussed today, which is significant, I think, in the way that boards are put together and decisions are made, not only curatorially through the director and so on, but through the makeup of how money comes to the door, and that comes in through boards. Tony, how do you understand the audience when it presses up against the door of the boardroom? Is that something that you consider, this way in which Juliana's talking about experiential, which you have also spoken about? Has the making of art at a board level changed, and if so, how?
I think what a board expects is balance and diversity within a program. So that implies that you need to have your big international shows, which requires big corporate investment, government investment. They also want to see local artist engagement. They want to see the investment of the institution. So in our case, the $30 million has to be spread across a broad suite of art history, of population interest, and we have.
And who decides that? How do you sit around and talk?
The staff, the professional staff.
Yeah, and they advise you?
We talk to the board about what we think is a good program, and we present that. And I think there's a lot of trust in our knowledge of the audience. The other thing about a contemporary museum is we know our audience extremely well now. The sort of surveying that our marketing departments do is really incredible. I mean, we know the profile of certain shows, we know how to get them back, we know when it's time to get them back, and then all the things that sort of underpin that go with corporate investment and those sorts of things. So I think these days we can speak quite comfortably in an informed way to boards and to the corporate sector and to the government about what is a responsible annual year of activity.
And philanthropy in that sense, in the past, I suppose, again, a clunky word, but a lot of the responsibility for this is through galleries like GoMA, not FONA, but it's been government money. So you've had an obligation, as one would to shareholders. You have had obligations to what one would perceive as the audience, and changing that. But private money coming in, has there been a shift there?
Huge shift.
And is that in the last 10 years?
It's since the building of GoMA.
Okay.
It's really noticeable that I think it's to do with programming, the profile of those programs, the infrastructure, the surge in attendance, the sustained growth in attendance as well. I think just the ambition that this place tries to project and the community pride in which it instills means that people who once may have given their work, their investment or their bequest or whatever it may have been to another cause are starting to think, I can see the community benefit of giving to this institution.
So it has been a building. In other words, the design, which is part of the core of our discussion tonight, has driven or given confidence for that shift. It's all come together.
The building has enabled the profile to increase, the opportunity to expand, all those sorts of things. Yeah, there's definitely a knock-on.
And just to stay with that for a second, and then I'd like to ask Brian, because he's in a totally different situation where you can do what you damn well want, really. Do the philanthropists, for want of a better word again, I don't know whether that word's out of date, do they come to you wanting certain things? Do you enter into partnership with them, or... So in other words...
We tailor according to their interests and needs, and we match them with our own.
Now that's a shift. Once we were grateful to give money and have other people make decisions, now we're not, on all levels, be it audience or investors. But not so for FONA. They've gone on their own way. That gives you a whole different sense of purpose. And can you explain how...
Well, it's the project of one man, David Walsh, and he has curators who bring him work, but he makes the decision in the end. And it actually is an interesting model. It's as good for you as how much you agree with what David's tastes are. But he doesn't actually care whether you like or hate. In fact, when you walk through the museum, there's an iPod-type device where you can click on every piece of work and say love or hate. Callum's work...
How am I going?
You're 12
out of 10.
I have the stats here.
Is it the most watched piece? Most touched piece?
It's number 7 most watched.
It's all right.
Yeah.
Well done, you.
Number 8 most loved. and number 9 most hated.
Ah,
But I think
So you're doing
that
well.
those numbers are skewed by the fact that it's one of the most watched. So it's interesting.
What is the
how
most
it's so
watched?
yeah, what's number 1?
Watched.
well.
It's a new
They
word.
click on it when
Yes.
when they're engaging with
Okay,
a
right.
work of art.
Okay.
So that's how we know how many visits your piece has in comparison to other.
I clicked
people's.
several times.
Yeah, that's right.
But
So-
didn't David Walsh say that the most popular works would then come off display?
Yeah, but it's also the least popular. No, it just means that it's being engaged, and that's what he wants people to engage. So the fact that they love and hate, I don't know how they can hate it. There's nothing really to
No,
hate
you'd be
about it.
surprised.
It's
People take
beautiful.
again things, you know.
You just don't want indifference.
Yeah, that's right. And we don't have a scale of 1 to 10. It's love and hate, so that's not really the
It's
way
not
things
like
They might
work.
be
like or not
dyslexic.
like on Facebook. Well, now this raises the question of collecting as well. Juliana, you're not really collecting in your gallery as
No, we don't
such.
collect. We make works
You
with
make
artists.
work, yeah.
I mean, we set it as our mission to make new works if we could, so we do a lot of commissioning. Callum's piece that's done at Mona was a commission for ACCA, and so we behave somewhat differently to a museum. Our scale is quite different. Our enterprise is more like a factory, you know, in a sense, and I guess we're the front line in a certain kind of a way.
Well, the public collection comes through GoMA. Just to come back to you, Tony, again, because you're making decisions for the public as such, how has your collecting eye changed in the last 10 years then? Because you're collecting pieces. I know there's not a lot of money for buying, so it means whatever you buy is very important. In the way that David Walsh is changing attitudes and shaping us really. How is collecting working now?
I think one of the things that's really shifted for us is that we've commissioned a lot more in recent times, in the same way that ACCA would, and a lot of that comes out of the Asia Pacific Triennial, where there's been a culture of doing that, for 20 years. Those works are often commissioned. The artist is funded to produce the work. Our response, our audience response, our curatorial response to that helps inform whether or not that is retained as an acquisition. Some of the strongest works put into this collection in the last 20 years have come out of that process. So they haven't evolved as a work that we've gone and seen somewhere else
How
and
do you
bought.
know they're the strongest works? Are they the most watched, or who
I
judges
suppose
that?
I'm being completely subjective. They're the ones that I think
Okay,
are really
fair
good.
enough.
Yeah. But I suppose our collecting is informed by still the same triggers of what we believe art historically makes sense, are going to be important stories or attributes of that artist or from that community or from that country at that time. It's about price, it's about matching it with donor interests, a whole lot of things that we look at. But I think the biggest shift is understanding an audience's response to a work and how that may inform future collecting patterns or interest in a particular artist practice.
And what's leading the pack at the moment at GoMA? Are they interested in video or painting or Indigenous art? Is there any? I know you know.
Indigenous is always important to us and to our audience, so that's an ongoing commitment and has been really since the 80s. Finches are doing pretty well at the moment, so yeah, that's something that we're looking. We will acquire that
More
work.
finches.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
A bird collection.
80% of the works in this current
An aviary.
exhibition are actually in our collection.
I think it's a testament to your collecting that you can do that, and it's becoming a real strength, because to mount a big show of this scale, if you had to bring everything in, would be astronomically expensive. And so it's great what GoMA is managing to do, because they're actually building great depth into their collecting, which means that they can then manifest a number of events and cross-pollinate things in an interesting kind of fashion. And I think that's a really clear success, that you can draw from the strength of your collection to do
From a
something
collecting
like that.
point of view, though, also it was about this show is also to encapsulate a message that we're known for our strength in the Asia Pacific. We're actually now making it a global strength, contemporary art. So we're representing South America and Africa in a way that I don't think anyone else in the country has ever done.
Yeah.
And even just through the modest investment we've made, that's a big shift, and that will be a commitment that I think we're all wedded to and to maintaining into the future.
I guess there is a shift with collecting practices in the sense you talked about large-scale works. It's unusual for me to have been a large-scale work of mine to be acquired into a collection. I mean, Mona would be the only one that has a large-scale
Why
work
do you
of
think
mine.
that is?
Well, storage.
Storage.
And so I think what has happened with this, the museum as a kind of event hub is that they commission more artists and they pay them a fee, which is, something that has gone on for a while in other places, Europe and America. So there are shifts in the way those things occur, that they're not about collecting the object so much, but acquiring the experience, I suppose.
Although, a lot of ACCA commissions have been bought. Actually, you've got quite a few of them here, Tony, which is nice. So it's, it does happen, which is great.
Well, the cast and holder slide we've acquired.
Yeah.
That's a big thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Now we've got
Does it slot together?
I've only got a few minutes left. If you want to ask a question, put your hand up now and we'll get to you with a microphone. If you want to tweet, #GoMA Talks, we will get to that too. Now, one of the things that came up earlier was, it's come up throughout the whole discussion, Callum just raised it in a practical sense, is the size of things and, how big can it get? Now, we haven't really mentioned online, we haven't mentioned that big space out there, and I'm wondering how artists are thinking about working with that and perhaps working more virtually or not. And I suppose it depends on which artist you speak to. And then how that's affecting how you shape a gallery, because it means you can go to a gallery but you don't have to be here. But there's another experience, and is it less of an experience? The artist.
Well, there is an artist called Matthew Griffin who is selling his work online on eBay at the moment, and he does a drawing a week and manages to survive like that. And it's a very interesting project because, in fact, he's bypassing his gallery in commercial terms and setting up his own industry, if you like. And to me, that's exciting. It's a way, it's the whole superstructure of it is contained within the online. I don't think that's been exploited enough, that kind of thing, by artists.
At the beginning of that.
Online galleries and those kind of things have happened, but actually using it as a democratic tool, there's a lot of rhetoric about its democracy, but actually using it is kind of undermined.
It's been going on in music for a long time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It breaks down what we used to see the artist as doing too, and we can share it in a different way. Tony, have you got any thoughts about the online world, the virtual world for GoMA?
I do, and number one is it doesn't actually reduce the visitor's intent or interest in coming for the real experience. There's this myth, and I think it was sort of 5 years ago more than now, but this sense that if you put everything online, if your web page is too good, your exhibition preview, it's like, well, I won't come. Well, no, that isn't going to happen, What is happening, though, is it is the resource shift within institutions. We had some people from the Tate here last week, and they said you have to start to build an interactive blog on your home page. So the face of your institution and this new voice coming through is one that has to be serviced 24 hours a day, because anything can get into a blog site. So those sorts of things are starting to develop, where an audience wants to instantly engage with someone who's going to answer their inquiry or their interest or their statement about what they've experienced or want to experience. So there's all these platforms and obligations that have completely changed the face of our sector and are going to change it even more radically. The greatest thing about it, though, is the opportunity to tell more and to say more to the visitor, pitching it at the various levels that all the different media platforms enable, so that when they come in here, they really come well armed for a great experience, if they want that.
Juliana, what are you experiencing with the
I agree.
online world?
I agree entirely with Tony. It's so nascent. I think there's so much that can happen with the electronic media and the internet. I think it will come into the museum as well, as we begin to see the way in which people want to gain information. We might see, into the 21st century much more fundamentally, ways of people actually gaining that quite discrete experience, a highly informational experience that is very tailored to their own requirements. We probably will see opportunities for the audience actually to self-curate from the collection via, there's so many different ways it could go.
We haven't explored.
But what will limit our abilities are really only, time, money and expertise. And that is building in, a threefold kind of event, even as we speak. I mean, the demand is huge. The way we can service that demand is going to be really quite testing, I think, for especially a lot of us at the smaller scale, because people are looking at what the larger galleries are doing and expecting a rather similar level of service from the smaller spaces, and that's going to be quite demanding and arduous in certain ways, but it's certainly exciting. And I myself am actually quite excited about three-dimensionality imaging as well, because I think we might see a growing archive of those things that are momentary and fleeting, but designed in such a manner that we can capture a certain part of it so that we don't lose those things too. And that's important for study and for knowledge down the track.
Can I just mention the memes lounge
Quickly,
outside
yes,
here too?
because
That's about a
end
whole
of
new
our
type
hour.
of visual literacy. That's 240 different stories there, all post-2004. So unthinkable as a project 10 years ago, but looking at the way that a whole new visual culture is starting to sort of enter our lives and influence our artists.
Now, lots of tweets. Honestly, we haven't been able to get to them all, and discussions here about putting GoMA website, working on mobile phones and things. You probably do that, but there's none. Street art, on it goes. It's a discussion to have between ourselves and each of us at home and everywhere we may go. There's a tweet here about JR, who's won the TED Wish, and I'm a TED girl, so I know about this one, and his big public project all around the world, which maybe a gallery or people here might like to pick up. But look, so many questions, so many ideas, not enough time. It's the old thing. I just want to say thank you to everybody tonight. Tony Elwood.
Was there a question up here?
We've got one question. We've got time for one question?
Yep.
A quick question, because we are now
I'll
running over time.
I'll be quick. Just the panel and Tony. Tony, this side is unique. You've got QAG at this end and GoMA at that end. I work here as a volunteer guide, and I know where the numbers of people are, and they tend to be at the GoMA end. How do you manage the tensions between kind of the museum end of the continuum at QAG, which it is, and the contemporary gallery end at GoMA?
Well, I think the statistics are interesting, and programming is a big part of that. We have a percentage of audience that will cut across both venues because they like all the different art histories and so on. If I look at the statistics around the Hats exhibition last year, numbers there tripled, numbers here halved. So it's very much about that audience level. The Met show over in QAG was a deliberate strategy to get more energy over in that building. We have a number of big exhibitions planned for QAG next year, which are about really giving that the primary voice during a period of about 4 months in the middle of the year. So to us, it's about a balance. We are seeing generally, though, more of a shift towards modern and contemporary art as an interest, more so than the historic art. But we still, we were just about to open Ethel Carrick Fox and E. Phillips Fox in QAG in about 3 weeks' time. That's a show that will cater to a more traditional visitor, and I think will build its own momentum as well.
Okay, we'll leave it there, and I'll thank everybody. Tony Elwood from GoMA and the Art Gallery here, 2 campuses. Callum Morton, artist from Melbourne. Juliana Engberg from ACCA in Melbourne, and Brian Ritchie from Fona Mona in Tasmania. And thanks to all the tweeters and people watching wherever they may be. This has been a GoMA Talk, and we welcome you back in 2 weeks' time to GoMA Talks Science. How are health and the environment linked in the 21st century, and are our lifestyles putting economies at risk? Hosted by my friend and colleague Paul Barclay from ABC Radio National Australia Talks. And that's it for this evening. Thank you.